The Prime Minister has flagged that restrictions on domestic travel could be lifted sooner rather than later as the country continues to see the curve flatten. There's also been calls, a lot of calls from business for the country to get back to work to avoid an economic downfall. Some say it could wipe $400 billion off our economy the longer we leave getting back to work. The Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, joins me now from Sydney. Paul, I want to start with the economic debate. It's really started to move, I'd say, in the last 4 or 5 days about, I think because we're through the worst of it in health terms, the focus is on avoiding what we can of the economic calamity that's headed our way. If we get back earlier, the argument is, can we make this the economic hit less? Where do you think it's headed? The language from the Prime Minister today was conciliatory on getting back to work.
I thought the language from Scott Morrison today, Peter, was very optimistic. Morrison is looking at restrictions being eased in about a fortnight's time. He wants the National Cabinet to be looking at this, to be looking at the strategy. And essentially what's happening here is the government, the Commonwealth and state will be trying to do two things. That is, maintain social distancing at the same time that they ease restrictions and we start to see the economy reignite. And we had a very powerful statement from the Business Council of Australia just a few days ago, arguing the need for this to happen and pointing out that the longer restrictions stay in place, the more damage will be done to the economy. Well, the government knows that, the government accepts that, and we're going to see action in about a fortnight's time.
I want to ask you too about the ongoing stoush about schools. Dantine put some money on the table today. It's money they would have been getting anyway, as I just said, but it's intended to break this impasse in Victoria. At the moment, no schools are open for term 2. I think the federal government's hoping if they could get a chink in the armour and they get one school cohort back, in this case independent and Catholic schools, that will then have parent power, that all schools go back, lest government schools are left behind. What's the motivation of Dan Andrews here? Because it's pitting the two health experts against each other. The Commonwealth health expert that all the other states are abiding by and sending kids back to school, well, certainly the other states are not being Queensland, but the others. And then the Victorian state health expert who's saying it's not safe to send children to school.
Well, what we're seeing here, Peter, is not just a difference of opinion between the Morrison government and the Victorian government, and also to an extent with the Queensland Labor government, but we're seeing competing strategies. And there's no doubt that one of the fascinating things about restarting the economy and restarting schools, of course, is that all states are doing it in their own way, according to their own timetable. And certainly Victoria is the most conservative state when it comes to starting things back up again. But Scott Morrison here is really interesting. He's in a very assertive mood. He's always believed that schools should be open. He's passionately attached to that. And this is the medical advice that the Commonwealth government is getting, and it's acting on this advice. And so what we've now got is, we've now got the independent and Catholic schools asked for some of the pledged Commonwealth government funds to be brought forward, and the government's agreed to that, but said, okay, well, if we're going to do that for the independent school sector, let's ensure that you go back to school at the same time. So we've now got this very significant policy conflict, strategic conflict between the two governments, Commonwealth and the Victorian government.
Is this brand differentiation for Dan Andrews? He would have to be, across the country, probably the most recognisable and strong-armed of the Labor premiers. And is this about him having sat at the table and been acquiescent with the federal government, the coalition, for some time? Is he, marking out some territory so his Labor mates don't think he's, gone native?
No, I don't think he's doing that. I don't think he's just playing a game of politics. I think this presumably is the strategy that the Victorian government believes is best for Victoria. What's conspicuous about that is it's a different strategy compared with what we're seeing from the other states, and it's particularly conspicuous when it comes to the school sector. One of the fundamental issues here, Peter, is the role of the teachers' federations and the extent to which the teachers' federations are having a profound influence here, particularly a profound influence when it comes to the Labor governments. So I think that these governments have got to be very careful about this particular issue. I mean, Scott Morrison did actually say the other day that we've got a lot of frontline workers here, medical workers, hospital workers, all sorts of other people accepting their responsibilities, working in the front line, and where are the teachers? Now, he didn't put it quite that
Paul,
bluntly,
but let me just jump in there. We know that children aren't, broadly speaking, at risk like other populations in the community from this virus. So put the children to one side. Clearly the concern from the unions is about infection amongst teachers, amongst the older people on the school ground. Well, the same could be said about people working in hospitals. Presumably most have PPE. But what about the people in the supermarkets or driving the buses or all the other places where they're in the public interaction space without all the protection that you might find in a medical community? Why is it okay for the Coles workers to turn up and look after us in close proximity, but it's not okay for the teachers to turn up and look after children, which we know are not necessarily themselves at risk? And we also know too that these teachers are being paid whether they're in the schools or not.
Well, I think these are highly relevant and pertinent questions, Peter. And I think increasingly the community will be aware of the difference here. And that's why I say that I think the teachers have got to be careful. I mean, there's a fundamental responsibility here when it comes to educating school children, and the way we educate them in a full sense is to ensure that they're educated in the classroom. There's also an equity issue here as well, because we know that when it comes to education, the teachers' federations are always talking about equity. Well, not opening the schools will disadvantage the underprivileged students much more than it will disadvantage the better off students. We know that as a fact. So I think there are a number of quite pressing issues here. It'll be fascinating to see just how long the Victorian government maintains this stance.
Talk to me about Eden-Monaro. I'm told by a number of people that tomorrow we'll see the resignation of Dr. Mike Kelly. And we know that John Barilaro is a name that's been thrown around for the National Party. Others on the Liberal side are saying people like Jim Molan may be prevailed upon to run. If that's the case, obviously it's a three-quarter contest. The Prime Minister made it very clear in his press conference when pushed today that a Liberal would run. So it doesn't look like there's going to be some backroom deal done to avoid that contest. He also made the point it's almost nigh impossible for a government to win that seat in a by-election, an incumbent government, obviously. Where do you see it playing out?
Well, I think this will be a fascinating by-election contest, Peter. And we saw Scott Morrison today attempting to lower expectations. Well, as a seasoned political operative, we could expect him to be doing that, stressing how difficult it would be, given the history of by-elections, for the government to actually win this seat. I think in private, though, the government would have some hopes of winning this seat, and it would make a very significant difference to the National Parliament, given that the Morrison government is really on a knife edge there in terms of the numbers. Scott Morrison indicated today that if there's a by-election, he would expect to see both the Liberal Party and the National Party in that contest. And there's no doubt that both the Liberals and the Nationals are in a position where I think they could put forward pretty competitive candidates, as you've just suggested. So I think the really fascinating thing about this is that this will be, I think, a very competitive contest. I think that despite that by-election history, the government would have a chance in this seat. And of course, given the situation at the moment, with the politics of the virus running very much the way of the Morrison government, this would be, I think, a really very tight and fascinating contest.
Well, much better for the PM now than it was at the end of the year. Paul Kelly, thanks very much for your time.